Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sleeping Night, where darkness hides incredible stories. Today, we'll dive into a world of mysteries, adventures, and unexpected twists. Get ready for a story that will keep you on edge from beginning to end. If you enjoy the story, make sure to subscribe and give a like. The market beneath the city, just after midnight. Jonas Vale walked the familiar, forgotten streets of the old city, tracing a map he knew only in dreams. He moved as if sleepwalking, hands tucked in the pockets of a threadbare coat, chin nuzzled in a scarf unraveling at the ends. He'd learned the route from whispers, those that slipped through the walls of his rented room, that haunted the faded plaster behind his pillow, that curled at the bottom of his cup when the tea was gone. None of them spoke to him directly. They just circled, waiting for his attention, and when he finally listened, they pulled him here. Beneath his feet, the cobblestones gleamed with the oily residue of a day's rain, but in the alleyways, where old lamplight fled, the stones ran dry and cold. Jonas passed through an unmarked arch, past the shriveled corpse of a once mighty acacia, and stopped at a storm drain wide enough for a child to crawl through. He bent, ignoring the bark of protest from his knees, and pressed his palm against the grate. It stung. The iron was bitter, crusted with rust and something else, something faintly sweet, like burnt sugar or blood. He pulled away, and the grate slid open with a wet, relieved sigh. He hesitated at the edge. The drop was little more than a yard, but what waited below was not darkness. It was light. Not the harsh blue glare of sodium street lamps, nor the honeyed glow of a candle left in a window, but something softer, more ambiguous, like fog backlit by the full moon. Jonas braced himself and let go. He landed in silence, knees flexing just enough to keep his teeth from clacking together. The air was thick with damp, but not unpleasantly so. As he straightened, Jonas was struck by the scent. Copper, yes, but also the exact smell of a library in midwinter. Old paper, linen bindings, the dust of centuries. He inched forward, trailing a hand along the tunnel's wall, which warmed under his touch. The passage bent sharply twice, then widened into a vault. The market beneath the city sprawled across the cavern like a living thing. Its stalls were cobbled together from scavenged wood, lacework iron, tarpaulins, and objects Jonas could not name. Glass globes that rippled as if filled with fish. Mirrors that reflected nothing but candle flame. Ladders leading nowhere. Doors suspended in midair. The crowd was dense, but no one touched. Figures moved in detours and ellipses, always skirting Jonas by a hand's breadth. They wore masks and hoods, veils of moth-eaten velvet or strips cut from funeral shrouds. Only their eyes, above all else, were eager and alive. Every stall sold something different, and nothing was what it seemed. One offered thin sheets of gold leaf curled in pillboxes, to be pressed beneath the tongue and dissolved for dreams of forgotten summers. Another sold jars of ink-black honey, the labels boasting in calligraphy, for sorrow, for sleep. The next peddled scraps of music bottled in long-necked flasks, to be uncorked and released at dusk for a moment's sweetness and ache. Everywhere, Jonas glimpsed things that should not exist. Hourglasses with bone for sand. Books that pulsed beneath their covers. Small silver cages of darkness that shuddered when approached. Jonas's own pockets were empty, but in the market this meant nothing. Trade was rarely barter and never coin. Already he felt hands brushing at the edge of his thoughts, probing for what he might be willing to surrender. A bad tooth, a grief, a color he no longer needed. He curled his fists and pushed on, resisting the urge to run his fingers along the goods. What if something stuck? What if something recognized him? He was looking for the merchant of forgotten names. The instructions he'd gleaned were insubstantial. Find the market. Follow the candles. If you listen, you'll hear the name. That last part made his jaw clench. Jonas didn't have a name to hear. He passed a stall where a woman in a fox mask carefully snipped bright origami birds from a roll of blue silk, then whispered to each before tucking it in a paper cage. She paused as he watched, her eyes catching his, and for a moment, Jonas saw a glint of recognition, or was it hunger, before she turned away. The market hummed with the sound of countless bargains struck and broken, the hush of desperate secrets packaged and sold. Jonas moved along, past a shelf of bottled voices, each stoppered with a twist of black hair. Past a stall where a stooped man baked loaves of bread full of words, their crusts etched with lines of poetry. He stopped at a stall whose sign was written in mirror script, "Destinies slightly used." The vendor, a pale child with teeth too sharp, pointed to a set of boxes stacked behind her.
"Looking for something?"
she said.
"Just passing through,"
Jonas managed. She smirked.
"Everyone's looking for something, especially you.
She slid a box toward him.
Try this on for size."
He touched the lid, felt a raw current race through his bones. He jerked back.
"No, thank you."
She shrugged, but he saw disappointment in her eyes, as if she'd lost a bet. The candles here burned with heartbeats instead of flames. Tiny, pulsing orbs that hovered at the lip of every stall. Some glowed green, some blue, some the shade of a bruise. Jonas followed a trail of these deeper into the market, where the crowd thinned and the stalls grew stranger. Here, the wares were not goods but absences. A stall selling regrets expertly extracted, another renting out empty hours for those who feared to sleep. It was in this liminal space, past the stalls and the crowd, that Jonas first heard his name. It was like the echo of a voice in a stairwell, not loud but insistent, and it made him slow even though he did not recognize it. He turned and saw, at the very end of the aisle, a lone figure behind a desk made of stacked ledgers. The merchant of forgotten names was older than Jonas expected, her hair gone to silver, skin mapped with tiny scars. She wore a collarless coat and gloves that seemed stitched from the negative of a photograph. Jonas approached, wary but compelled. The merchant regarded him with a gaze both sharp and kind.
"You've come a long way,"
she said.
"I don't remember the way back,"
Jonas replied, unsure if it was a question or an accusation. She smiled, and it was neither cruel nor gentle.
"That's how most end up here?"
He waited for her to speak again, but instead she turned, rummaged beneath the counter, and produced a small wooden box. It was unremarkable, save for the label pasted crookedly on its lid. Jonas squinted at it, heart thumping, then reached out to touch the name written there. It was his. Part 2. A name given back. The box was lighter than Jonas expected, its weight all in the expectation, not the wood. He ran his thumb over the label, feeling the faint burr of torn paper where someone, no, he, had once tried to scrape it off. The merchant waited, hands folded, her patience absolute.
"A name once forgotten is never yours alone,"
she said, and there was a stillness to her that made Jonas think of the moment before a glass tips and shatters.
"You can take it, but it will change you, or you will change it."
He fumbled the box open while still standing at her stall, driven by urgency and a dread so familiar it felt almost familial. Inside was a folded piece of parchment, old enough that the edges curled. But the ink, His name, Jonas Vale, was startlingly fresh. He stared at it for a very long time, as if the letters themselves might rearrange or vanish when he blinked. He pressed thumb and forefinger to the paper. The air thickened. A taste like burnt matches and winter stuck to the roof of his mouth. The memory came without warning, a jolt behind the eyes, laughter in a room with velvet curtains, blood spattering a white tiled floor, the sound of a woman's voice saying, "Don't come back." The words were muffled, as if underwater, and the face attached to them slipped from focus even as he reached for it. Jonas recoiled, nearly dropping the box. The merchant's face was unreadable.
Names are dangerous,
She said.
They are how the world finds you.
He wanted to ask questions about the voice, about the blood, about why the name felt like a pair of ill-fitting shoes, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he clutched the box to his chest and turned away, feeling the merchant's gaze like a hand at his nape until he was lost again in the market's weave. The return journey through the market beneath the city was different, and not only because Jonas now carried a version of himself he'd been without. The crowd seemed thinner, though no less intent. The masked faces, the veiled eyes, all turned toward him as he passed, and where before they had moved in graceful arcs to avoid him, now they parted only just in time, brushing his sleeves, grazing his elbows, leaving behind the faintest static prickle. No one spoke to him, but he felt the echo of his name ripple ahead of him, a tide of recognition that disturbed the surface of every transaction, every whispered bargain. He hurried through the stalls, wanting only to reach the tunnel's mouth, but the market had stretched itself, the way dreams do when you realize you're dreaming but cannot wake. He passed the same stand twice, a man selling fractured mirrors that reflected his face, each time with a different scar, and on the third pass, the vendor reached out and pressed a shard into his hand.
"For you,"
the vendor said, his words crusted with an accent Jonas almost recognized. He looked down. The mirror piece was edged in gold, and when he peered into it, he saw himself as a boy, mouth open in surprise or terror, a bruise blooming just below his left eye. He left the shard on a passing barrel, but the image clung. Somewhere behind him, someone started to laugh. The sound bobbed and wove through the market, catching up to him at the foot of a crooked stairway, where a pair of women in matching owl masks watched him, heads tilted in pendulum synchrony. He looked away, but as he did, he caught sight of a poster tacked to a stall, a child's drawing, crude and hurried, but unmistakably his own face, the slope of his nose, the thick brows, the mouth set in stubborn resolve. Underneath, in block capitals, Jonas Vale, missing. He stood staring until the stall-keeper, a woman with her own face painted on a dozen eggs lined up before her, gently turned the poster over.
Some things are better left lost.
She murmured. Jonas almost believed her. The market air soured as he pushed deeper, the scent of honey and ink giving way to something acrid, anticipation, or maybe warning. He tried to retrace his steps, but the geometry of the place had changed. Tunnels looped where before they ran straight. Stairs rose and fell without logic, and at every turn there was another reminder. A scrap of newspaper pinned behind glass, a silver locket etched with a J, a book that, when he opened it, was filled with nothing but his name, written over and over in trembling script. He started to avoid eye contact, but it didn't help. Even those with faces obscured seemed to glance at him from behind their masks, and more than once he caught a mouth forming the syllables of his name, soundless but unmistakable. He began to walk faster, his heart rattling against his ribs. The box in his coat pocket grew heavier, as if with every step it absorbed another memory, another claim to his identity. He ducked into an alley he didn't remember from before, hoping to lose himself. But at the far end, he found a wall covered in handbills and photographs, curling and yellowed. All were of him, in places he recognized only halfway. In a schoolyard, on a city tram, in a grim hospital corridor. Most were dated years apart, but in each one his face was nearly unchanged. The same uneasy smile, the same uncertain eyes. Beneath them, scrawled in pencil, "Remember, remember, remember." He backed away, his knees weak, and nearly collided with a beggar perched on a crate. The beggar's eyes were cataracted but sharp, and when Jonas tried to sidestep, the man's hand shot out and grasped his wrist.
"You're late."
The beggar rasped, and Jonas felt the words crawl under his skin. He tried to pull away, but the old man's grip was iron.
"Let me go."
Jonas hissed, voice cracking.
"I don't know you."
The beggar grinned, exposing teeth like chipped marble.
"We've all been waiting for you, Vale. You've been missed."
He let go, but not before pressing something into Jonas's palm. It was a coin, ancient and worn smooth, but even in the dim light he could see his own profile stamped into one side. Jonas dropped it, half expecting it to burn through the market floor. He broke into a run, desperate for the staircase that led up and out. The market blurred around him, a carousel of faces and names and hands reaching for him, and he clutched the box tighter, afraid that if he let it go, it would vanish, and he would vanish with it. He found the exit by accident, stumbling through a curtain of strings hung with dried flowers that snapped and scattered under his passage. He emerged onto the steps below the storm drain and climbed, knees trembling, fingers numb. The city night above was unchanged, cold and wet and indifferent, but Jonas felt every molecule of it pressing against his skin, as if he'd been gone for years. He walked home without seeing the way, letting his feet do the remembering. He locked the door to his room, drew the curtains, and sat on the bed with the box in his lap, staring at it until dawn. Every hour or so, he would touch the parchment inside, feeling the tug of memory, the needle prick of guilt, the soft thrumming of something lurking just out of reach. He stopped going out in daylight. The city was not safe. It was too bright, too full of people who stared at him with the uncanny intensity of those who recognize something they cannot name. He found his own face on missing person posters, on the backs of milk cartons, in a police sketch that aired once, briefly, on the evening news. Each time the details differed. Hair a little lighter, jaw a little sharper, eyes a touch more hollow, but always the same name, Jonas Vale. He started to suspect that the name had been waiting for him all along, that it had been floating through the market for years, attaching itself to those who strayed too far from who they were supposed to be. He wondered how many Jonases there had been before him, and whether any of them had fared better. The nights brought no peace. His dreams were a loop of the same memory. The woman's voice, the laughter, the blood, the click of a door closing forever. Sometimes he caught a glimpse of the woman herself, her back to him, red hair braided down to her waist, her hands busy with something just out of sight. He always woke before he saw her face. Paranoia grew roots in his mind. He covered the mirrors in his room, then covered the windows, then stopped answering the phone. He began to fear the box, but feared more what might happen if he threw it away, or if it simply returned, as things in the market were said to do. One evening, just after sunset, he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his door. He waited, breath held, and after a minute, a pale envelope slid under the door. Jonas waited another hour before touching it, but inside was only a slip of paper, blank except for the single word, remember. The handwriting was his own. That night, Jonas made up his mind. He dressed, pulled on his old coat, and retraced the path to the market. Down the alleyways, past the ruins of the train station, down a set of stairs damp with city runoff, and through the door that was never in quite the same place twice. He didn't know what he was hoping to find. Maybe the merchant, maybe the beggar, maybe whoever or whatever had orchestrated this trap around his name. But the market had changed again. Gone was the press of crowds, the hum of commerce. Every stall was shuttered, every lamp guttering. He moved through the emptiness as if underwater, following the echo of his own footsteps, until he reached the place where the merchant's tent had stood. In its place, a single table draped in red. Upon it, a ledger book, a glass of water beaded with condensation, and a folded note addressed to Jonas Vale, current. He sat. He drank the water and opened the note. It was brief, written in a looping hand he knew instinctively to be his own. Some debts can only be paid in person. Wait. So he waited, listening to the market settling around him, the air growing colder and more brittle by the minute. At last, someone else arrived. Not the merchant, but a woman. Her hair was braided as it had been in his dreams, and her face, when she drew back her hood, was at once familiar and utterly alien. She looked at him as if through layers of glass, as if she wasn't sure he was real.
You,
she said, then paused, as if searching for a better word.
You're not the same, are you?
Jonas tried to answer, but the question was too large for language. He shook his head. She sat across from him.
I thought you were dead. I saw them take you. The last time, I mean.
I don't remember,
Jonas said, and was surprised to find that it was true. The woman reached for his hand. He let her, and her touch sparked a current of memory so strong it nearly drove him from the chair. Laughter, blood, the scent of winter and burnt matches. The word remember repeated like a curse. She winced.
They told me you'd come back.
She said.
Different, but not.
Who are you?
Jonas asked. She smiled, the saddest smile he'd ever seen.
Some things are better left lost,
she said, echoing the market vendor. Then,
I loved you. Once.
There was so much he wanted to say, but time pressed at the edges of the room. Already he could feel the next version of himself approaching, the next Jonas drawn by the same hunger, the same lack. He saw now how the market worked, how it traded not in objects or secrets, but in the currency of selves, each name a vessel, each vessel waiting to be filled. He stood to leave, but the woman caught his sleeve.
Will you remember me?
She asked. He thought of the box at home, the slip of parchment, the endless repetition of his own name. He did not know how to answer. Instead, he walked the empty market, following the thread of his own footsteps, feeling the weight of the debt he carried. Above him, the city pulsed with life, oblivious. Below, in the market, the stalls would reopen, the merchant would return, and another Jonas Vale would come looking for what he had lost. The cycle was as old as the city, older than the market, and as inevitable as memory. But for now, he walked and tried to remember the sound of the woman's voice and the shape of his own name and what it meant to be himself. Asterisk. He was not the first. The records proved it. He learned to find the hidden archives, the shelves behind false walls, the sealed boxes stashed in derelict warehouses and forgotten municipal basements. Each time, he felt the tug, the city's need for him, or his need for the city, he couldn't say. Some documents were in languages he didn't recognize. Some in ciphers only his hands seemed to know how to unravel. In every decade, every era, a Jonas Vale appeared. Sometimes a clerk, sometimes a thief, sometimes a wayward priest. A handful of crimes repeated like a chorus. Embezzlement, a fire set in a hospital, a child gone missing. But the records agreed on only one thing. Jonas Vale was always presumed dead, never found, never mourned. He wondered if the name was a disease or a curse, or simply the city's method of patching itself. He wondered who wrote the reports, who tracked the appearances, who maintained the ledgers in the market beneath. He wondered if he could destroy the name, or if it would just grow back, like a lizard's tail. Eventually, he returned to the market at the appointed hour, note in hand. He followed the warren of tunnels as before, but the market's mood was altered. Every merchant watched him openly. No one called his name, but he heard it anyway, carried on the current of commerce, and whispered through the latticework of the crowd. He made his way past the stand of fractured mirrors, now empty, only a note, out of reflections. Past the eggs painted with faces, now all bearing his own. Past the beggar, now replaced by an empty crate and a sign, vacant. At the center of the market, a ring of people waited, and the merchant stood at their head. She wore a different mask now, enameled bone, the suggestion of a coyote or a wolf, and her dress glimmered with something that might have been scales. She lifted one hand to silence the gathered crowd.
Jonas Vale,
She said. The name was a bell tolling through the market. He stepped forward. His hands shook, but he kept them at his sides. The merchant regarded him with what might have been pity.
You have learned the rules.
She said.
You have learned the cost.
Jonas nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak.
Do you wish to settle your account?
She asked. Every syllable weighted with consequence. He hesitated.
What happens if I do?
The merchant spread her hands.
The market is satisfied. The city is satisfied. You may become something else, or you may disappear entirely.
She leaned forward.
Or you may choose to keep the name and let the cycle continue.
He thought of the woman in the market, of the voices in his dreams, of the impossible recursion of memory. He realized he didn't want to vanish. Not really. He wanted to see what would happen if he stayed.
I'll keep it,
He said. The merchant inclined her head.
Then the market will watch and wait.
With that, the crowd dissolved. The market returned to its usual bustle, and Jonas wandered the stalls, feeling the eyes upon him, feeling the name settle over his bones like a suit of chainmail. He left the market through a different tunnel, emerging days later, he could never tell how much time passed, into a city subtly changed. The weather was warmer, the posters were gone. His building had been repainted. In the mirror, he looked the same as always, but the box in his apartment was lighter, and when he opened it, the slip of parchment had faded to a ghost of itself. He closed the lid and placed it high on a shelf, where he could reach it if he needed to, but only if he wanted to. For weeks, nothing happened. He worked odd jobs. He walked the city. Sometimes he dreamed, but the dreams were muted. No more blood, no more laughter, only the slow, steady beat of routine. He let himself believe for a while that he'd won. But deep in the market, in a room with velvet curtains, the merchant prepared a new box, a new name. Another Jonas Vale somewhere would begin to search for himself, and the cycle would begin again. And one day, on the coldest morning of the year, Jonas opened his door to find a man waiting on the stoop. A man with his own face, but older, eyes sharper, smile hungrier. The man extended a hand.
Jonas Vale?
He asked. Jonas stared for a long time before answering.
I suppose I am.
He said. The man grinned.
Not for long.
He pressed something into Jonas's palm, a coin stamped with the profile of a stranger, and walked away. Jonas closed his fist around the coin, feeling its impossible weight, and for the first time understood what it meant to be himself. He stood in the cold, letting the city settle around him, and waited for the next turn of the cycle. Jonas did not return to the market by any route he remembered, and he would never afterward recall the stairs he climbed or the alleys he ran, only the feeling of being watched, drawn, summoned by a name that came to mean something more than ownership or destiny. He passed the bakery whose windows had been blacked out with paint, the vendor with the birds in tin cages, the boy in the ragged watchman's uniform who had never grown an inch older, and with each step, he felt the city drawing the marrow from his bones, leaving only the ache of names unspooling behind him. The market was no longer hidden, or maybe he had become part of it, a cell in its slow, recursive hunger. The way narrowed, then widened, and he found himself standing in a gallery of silence. There were no other shoppers, no calls from the stalls, only rows and rows of empty stands, all pointed toward the center, where the merchant stood behind a table draped in black velvet. She wore the same mask, or perhaps a new one made to look like the old, bone-white, eyeless, a mouth drawn in a perpetual smile. Her hands rested on a ledger so large it bowed the table beneath it. She did not speak, but the emptiness throbbed with the expectation of parley, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jonas approached, clutching the slip of paper that still bore his name, the last artifact of his old self. His hands shook.
I want to make a return,
He said, and heard how small he sounded.
I want my old name back.
The merchant opened the ledger. The pages were thin and yellowed, covered in script so tiny it seemed to move on its own. Jonas saw with the clarity of falling that every name had a line through it, except his. His burned with fresh ink, as if the page could not contain it. Underneath, a second line. Resold, active.
I see you have not read the warranty.
The merchant said, voice like water poured over stones.
Once the contract is signed, the name is not yours to return.
Jonas shook his head, desperate.
You told me I could be anyone I wanted if I just paid the price.
The merchant's smile deepened. And what is it you want now?
Jonas Vale?
He tried to answer, but the question was bigger than any desire he possessed. He wanted to go home, but he didn't remember where home was. He wanted to live, but the word had shifted, become a thin shell filled with someone else's expectations. He wanted to undo the trade, to unmake the deal, to step outside the shadow of himself. But he was already too far gone.
Please.
He tried.
There has to be a loophole, a way out.
The merchant extended a single finger, pointing to a passage beneath his name.
There is no escaping a name once it has been written into the ledger.
She said.
You wanted to be someone. You forgot that being someone means taking the weight of their sins.
The market trembled, a low rumble rising from the stone beneath his feet. Jonas's legs buckled. He fell to one knee, then the other. The stall lights flickered, then guttered, plunging the space into a darkness pierced only by the blue-white phosphorescence around the merchant's mask. He looked up at her, searching for mercy.
If I can't have my old life, can I at least sell this one? Can I pay the debt forward?
The merchant considered, tilting her head in a gesture of infinite patience.
It is possible,
She intoned.
but the transaction has already occurred. Your name is spoken for, your essence resold. The next owner will arrive shortly.
Jonas felt it then. A tug at the base of his spine, a burning behind his eyes, an unbearable sense of anticipation. He tried to stand, to protest, but his limbs would not answer. A ripple passed through the market. The air grew thick, metallic. His reflection formed in the darkness beside him. Not flat, not a surface, but a full-bodied echo, every detail of his own face rendered in uncanny precision. The reflection smiled, teeth white and predatory.
Who are you?
Jonas asked, voice strangled. The reflection stepped forward, peeling itself from the wall.
I think you know.
It said. Its words were his, but the inflection was wrong. Cruel, hungry, delighted. Jonas staggered back, clutching the slip of paper.
You're just another version of me. I won't let you take it.
He tried to run, but the market folded around him, every exit sealed with the pressure of his own name. The reflection advanced, growing sharper with each step, colors leaching from Jonas's vision and pooling in the double's eyes. The market's stalls groaned, the air shimmered, and he knew in the deep marrow of his bones that what he faced was not an enemy, but the sum total of every desire, every regret, every transaction he had ever made. He turned to the merchant in last desperation.
Help me!
He begged. She closed the ledger with a sound like final judgment.
You chose to be remembered.
She said.
Now be remembered.
The reflection reached him, and with a motion gentle as a lover's touch, pressed its palm to his chest. Jonas felt himself begin to unravel, his history and hopes and fears siphoned out and poured into the waiting vessel. It was painless, almost sweet, the relief of surrender, of setting down a burden he'd carried too long. His hands grew transparent, his voice faded to a whisper. He watched as the other Jonas pulled on his coat, squared his shoulders, smiled with the confidence of a man who knew he was real. He drifted, insubstantial, until only a single thread bound him to the world. The new Jonas leaned over the table, grinning at the merchant.
I believe there's a debt to collect,
he said, voice smooth as smoke. The merchant slid the slip of paper across the velvet, and the new Jonas took it without hesitation, tucking it into his pocket. He turned to leave. Jonas, ghostly, found the last question in the hollow of his throat.
What's your name?
He asked, no louder than a thought. The other Jonas smiled, a smile so bright it hurt to look at.
Jonas Vale,
he replied, and vanished into the hunger of the city. The merchant closed his ledger, spine cracking like the brittle neck of a bird. Another transaction balanced, another story come to a close. He lingered behind the counter, letting the silence seep in, pooling at his feet and rising to his knees. With each cycle, the market grew quieter. The echoes stretched thinner, and the yawning absence after a name's erasure was more profound than any pitch of commerce or barter. He did not always mask his face, especially after hours. Tonight, he set the mask aside, placing it on the counter with tenderness. No one would see him, not even the lamplighter who made his rounds so meticulously, so pointlessly, through the tunnels that led to this place. Tonight, the market was truly empty. No footsteps, no haggling, no children darting between stalls. Only him, the lamps, and the infinite ledgers. The merchant ran his hand over the surface of the book, feeling the indentations of every name that had ever been pressed into its vellum, every quiver of penmanship a fossil of longing or regret. He closed his eyes and, for a moment, let the fullness of memory crowd his mind. The girl with glass bones who'd traded her reflection for a day of sunlight. the old man who'd swapped every memory but one for a final hour in his lover's arms. The three sisters who'd divided themselves up so finely that none of them remembered who they were or why they shopped together. He stood from the table, bones popping gently, and drifted down the central avenue of the market. The lamps here, candles, really, but no ordinary wax or wick, burned with a light the color of bruised fruit. They guttered as he passed, sensing the mood, the gravity of what had just transpired. In the hush, he could hear the faintest hum, the vibration of 1,000 names, restless, swirling, colliding in the dark. The merchant stopped before a shelf of glass boxes, each no bigger than a child's fist, and peered at the contents. Each box contained a slip of paper, a coin, a stone, a feather. Artifacts, tokens, sometimes the only proof a person had ever lived, or at least lived as themselves. Some of the boxes vibrated faintly, like the heart of a bird in a cage. Others sat inert, utterly still. Sometimes, in the small hours, he would take a box off the shelf, open it, and breathe in the last smell of the old owner. He wondered if anyone would do the same for him. The market was full of such shelves, some stacked so high even he couldn't reach the top. But tonight, he moved with purpose along the central aisle, pausing where the shadows pooled thickest. He traced the curve of a display case, fingers rippling through the dust, and stopped at the exhibit that housed the rarest items, the names that had never been resold, the lives that had no buyer. He handled these with reverence, even fear. To be unclaimed in this place was to be lost forever, and the market did not forgive a void. He halted in front of a particular box, set apart from the others. It was older by centuries, if not millennia, and bore the scar of a fire long extinguished. The label read, "Ilara, the librarian who remembered every soul." The merchant reached for it, and as his hand drew near, the air seemed to thicken, shimmer, resist. He remembered the day she'd come to him, her eyes black with exhaustion, her voice so soft he had to lean in to hear it. She'd traded her name for a perfect memory, and now even she was fading.
Ah,
He murmured, voice a thread in the vastness.
so even she is fading.
Elsewhere, in the world above, the city pulsed and slept and woke again. Down here, the candles burned lower, each flame a tongue of memory, some hungry, some guttering out. The merchant made his way back to the ledger, passing rows of empty stalls, each one a monument to a transaction finished, a desire sated or denied. He wondered, not for the first time, whether the market was a parasite or a priesthood, whether it served or condemned. He sat at his desk, drew the ledger close, and ran a thumb over the final name in the column. Jonas Vale. Even now, the ink shimmered slightly, as if the name still resisted, still tried to wriggle free. The market had claimed him, as it claimed all who entered, but it was never a clean kill. Every name fought back in the end. He tidied his wares, reset the mask, readied the market for the next day's slow procession of souls. For now, though, he allowed himself a rare indulgence, to close his eyes and imagine a world where the market was no longer needed, where every name remained intact, untraded, at peace. But such a world was a fiction, and the merchant was not in the business of fictions. He was the last witness, the final archivist of the lost, and he would watch until all names were gone. The candles burned low, and the market slept again. Only the echo of names remained. Part 1. The Market Below. They said the market was older than the city built above it, a leftover vein of a world with no name, where the sun had never pried its way in. It was not advertised nor mapped, nor mentioned by those with even the faintest grip on self-preservation. It was not the kind of place you could ask about, not even among the most corrupt of the city's underbelly. To know the market was to risk being known by it, and the market, like all ancient intelligences, never forgot a debt or a face. Kieran did not know how he had heard of it. The market was not a thing you learned about, but rather a thing that learned you. Maybe it began with the sleepless nights, the way his dreams had started to tangle with other people's memories, flickering like celluloid through his half-open eyes. Maybe it began with the hunger, growing each day, gnawing at his ribs and tongue, and the place behind his skull where names lived. It was impossible to say when it started, though he sometimes suspected it had always been with him, working its way through the cracks of his ordinary life until, one day, he recognized it as a calling. There were 3 supposed entrances to the market, none of which existed in daylight or in the waking mind. The first was a rusted elevator shaft in an abandoned textile mill, sealed so thoroughly that no one remembered what it had been built for, or if it had ever worked. The second, a staircase hidden behind a wall of wet plaster in the old foundry district, where the walls sweated and wept and sometimes bled rust even in the dead of winter. The third was a trapdoor in the nave of a heretic's church, where the pews had rotted to dust and the stained glass saints had all been replaced by empty panes of gray. There were probably other ways in, but these were the agreed-upon vectors, the ones repeated in half-whisper to those who could be trusted not to come back from the telling. Kieran's entrance was none of these. It waited for him in the liminal hour when the streets emptied and the city's pulse slowed to a crawl. A doorway behind a noodle shop, its frame too narrow and its threshold set at a sickeningly sharp angle. There was no sign, no handle, no bell. Only a rectangle of darkness, as smooth and featureless as a knife wound. He could have kept walking, but the knowing in his bones told him that to pass by was to be followed for the rest of his life, or longer. The first time, he stood there for a minute, maybe 2, his heart thumping a warning in his chest. Even the rats kept their distance. The smell was not of food nor rot, nor any natural decay, but a cold metallic tang, like the inside of a safe that had not been opened in decades. His hand lifted before he willed it. The darkness had gravity. He stepped through, and the world unspooled. The stairwell was narrower than it should have been. The walls flexed in and out as if breathing. Light was a rumor, pale, sourceless, the color of teeth that had never seen a toothbrush. The steps curved down in a spiral, each tread warped and slippery, as if worn by centuries of feet, heavier or more desperate than his. With every step, the air thickened, and the memory of the city above frayed at the edges. He thought, at first, that the market would be empty, a mere myth, or else abandoned by all but the most desperate. But as he descended, the noise built up. A hum, then a murmur, then a chorus of voices, none of them speaking any language he recognized, but all of them familiar in their longing. It was not a market for goods, exactly, but for things harder to name, regrets, secrets, the rights to dreams, the bones of old families, the echoes of names that no longer belonged to the living. It did not appear on maps, nor in memory. It existed only for those who needed it badly enough. Kieran had not meant to go there. He had only followed a whisper, a voice that spoke in the back of his mind, calling him by a name that didn't belong to him anymore. The market was waiting. The market below existed in a perpetual dusk, hovering just beneath the threshold of reality, a place that seemed to inhale light and exhale shadows. the cavernous vaults stretched on forever, crowded with stalls whose wares flickered and changed when one tried to pin them down. The floor was cobbled not with stone, but with the cast-off coins of 100 empires, their values lost to time, worn smooth by the passing of desperate feet. The air was thick with the scent of burning salt, old paper, and a sweeter, more dangerous perfume that Kieran could not name. Lanterns hung from the ceiling on rusted chains, each flame caged by glass that fractured the light into bruised hues. Copper so deep it bordered on blood, violet with the melancholy of a fading bruise, gold that flickered with undertones of green and blue. The effect left no corner untouched by color, yet nothing was truly illuminated. It was a market of secrets, after all, and secrets thrived in half-light. Kieran kept his head down and his hands in his coat pockets, moving through the crowd with the careful, deliberate posture of someone who knew exactly how much attention to attract. Not too little. That was the fastest way to be noticed. Not too much. That was how the market marked you forever. The stalls themselves were equal parts bazaar and mausoleum. Each was manned by a vendor whose strangeness seemed tailored to the wares. On his left, a woman in a cracked porcelain mask sold childhoods, the glass bottles on her table shimmering with suspended fragments, a first lost tooth, the taste of rain on bare skin, the moment of being carried to bed while half asleep. Some buyers haggled, others wept. The currency here was always symbolic. A lock of hair, a photograph, a blood stain on linen. Prices were arbitrary, but never unfair. The market enforced its own kind of balance. A few stalls down, a man with a mouth sewn permanently shut, the stitches were red cord, waxed and tight, displayed trays filled with coins stamped with faces no longer in circulation. He traded only in memories of forgiveness. Kieran watched as a woman in a threadbare wedding dress placed a single tear on the counter. The vendor weighed it, nodded, and slid her a coin that immediately darkened her palm. She clutched it to her chest, a choked noise escaping her throat before she vanished into the crowd. Further on, there were merchants who trafficked in forgotten languages, letting the alphabets slither across parchment like living things. Others hawked unwritten books, their pages blank until the buyer's hands made contact. Some stalls specialized in dreams, but not the kind you actually dreamt. These were nightmares distilled from the city, or ambitions that hadn't yet occurred to anyone. The market was an ecosystem. Everything that entered had to be paid for, and everything left a trace. Kieran wove through all this, his presence like a ripple beneath the surface, trying not to dwell on the fact that he himself was being observed, catalogued, and weighed. The market did not tolerate tourists. He'd come for one reason only. He could see the merchant's stall from nearly any vantage point in the market. It was the black hole at the center of the chaos, small and modest, but possessed of an impossible gravity. The booth was draped in velvet so black it made the air around it shiver, and marked only by a single, unremarkable mirror. The mirror famously reflected nothing. Not the booth, not the merchant, not even the market itself. The merchant of forgotten names sat at his post, unmoving. His face was shrouded in a veil of thin, yellowing gauze, almost transparent, but not quite. His hands, gloved in kid leather, the color of bone, rested on the surface of the counter, folded in the manner of a patient doctor or a particularly cruel priest. Kieran approached, feeling the eyes of the market on his back, and waited to be acknowledged. He was not. The merchant regarded him with complete indifference, as if Kieran were merely another item passing through, of little consequence. The silence stretched. Kieran realized with a prickle of humiliation that he did not know the proper etiquette. Was he supposed to offer something? To speak first? The rules here were never written, only learned by trial and error in the market was often fatal. He cleared his throat, the sound small and insufficient.
I want to buy back my name,
He said. The merchant's head cocked, just perceptibly, as if Kieran had said something terribly quaint.
Yours?
The merchant asked, voice so dry it sounded like a page being turned in an ancient book.
Or the one you believe is yours?
Kieran felt his cheeks flush, anger and shame mixing in the hollow of his chest.
the one they took from me.
He said, firmer this time. The merchant's hands unfolded, one gloved finger tapping the black velvet. Ah, he said, as if this explained everything.
Then we have a problem.
The veil shifted as the merchant reached beneath the counter, producing a small black book. Its cover was unmarked, except for a sigil pressed into the leather, a looping figure that seemed to wriggle when viewed from the corner of one's eye. The book quivered slightly in the merchant's hands, as though resisting being opened. The merchant laid the book on the counter with a gentleness that felt almost obscene, given the circumstances. He opened it. The pages inside shone for an instant, each one a mirror of sorts, reflecting 1,000 shreds of spectral handwriting, none of which remained stable for more than a second. Kieran leaned closer, unable to help himself. The book was alive with motion, the names inside crowding the margins, erasing and rewriting themselves, endlessly jockeying for position.
Every name has a price.
The merchant whispered, running a finger along the edge of the page.
And every name has an owner. Sometimes two.
The finger stopped, resting on a single line, a word that trembled with recognition, like a spider sensing the first touch of prey on its web. Kieran stared. The word was his. The name he'd lost, the one that had been taken from him, written in ink so dark it seemed to drink the light. He felt a jolt, visceral and immediate, as if someone had just whispered it in his ear. Then below it, in a smaller, stranger hand, was another name he did not recognize. The merchant closed the book with a snap, and the lamps in the market guttered, as if startled by the sound.
Your name is not wholly yours,
said the merchant, voice lower now, almost sympathetic.
It is contested, disputed.
Kieran reeled.
By who?
The merchant regarded him through the gauze, eyes unreadable.
That is the business of markets,
He said.
Perhaps you will learn the other bidder in time. For now, you must decide what you are willing to pay.
He tilted his head.
And what you are willing to lose.
Kieran felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He thought of the city above, of his life before the market's gravity had pulled him down. He wondered what remained of him in that other world. He wondered if anyone was looking for him, or if the absence had already filled itself in. He looked back at the merchant, desperate.
What is the price?
The merchant's gloved hand lifted, palm open.
Make your offer.
Kieran cast around for something, anything, of value. He had no money, nothing but the scraps of himself that had survived the descent into this place. He remembered suddenly the advice he'd been given long ago, by someone whose face he could no longer recall. In the market below, everything costs more than you think, but less than you fear. Offer only what you cannot bear to keep. He reached into his coat, fingers trembling, and drew out the smallest thing he owned, a faded photograph, folded and refolded until the edges had started to blur. The image was nearly gone, but he knew what it showed. A house by a river, a woman in a red scarf, a child, arms outstretched, running into the sunlight. He did not remember who the woman was. He did not remember if the child was himself. The photo was an anchor, and also a stone. He set it on the velvet. The merchant regarded it, then plucked it up with infinite care. The merchant pressed the photo between his palms, and for a moment, Kieran thought he heard a tiny sigh, as if something inside the paper had just released its last breath. Then the merchant nodded, satisfied. In return, the merchant slid a slip of paper across the counter. On it was written Kieran's lost name, and beneath it, the other name, the one written in the book, but in a hand he did not recognize. He took the paper, holding it gently, afraid it might dissolve.
Go,
said the merchant, already turning away.
find the other claimant. Only then will you know the true price.
Kieran stood there, bewildered, the slip of paper burning in his hand. He felt the market stir around him, as if every vendor and every stall had been waiting for this moment. He looked down at the names, and for the first time in years, he understood nothing at all. The merchant turned the book so Kieran could read the line for himself. There, in unmoving black ink, was the verdict. Registered, claimed by prior bearer. The words sat on the page like a fingerprint on a pane of glass, oily and immutable, already seeping into the next line. Kieran's mouth worked, searching for a sound to fill the vacuum.
What does that mean?
The question came out as little more than a gasp, the syllables dry and thin as moth wings. He half expected the merchant to laugh, to savor the moment before explaining the cruel joke in market terms. But the veiled figure simply closed the book, careful as a priest with a sacred text.
It means
The merchant said.
that someone else is already living as you.
The impact of the words was immediate and total. Kieran felt his stomach tighten to a cold knot. For a moment, he was aware of everything at once. The heat and stink of the market, the nervous shimmer of the lamps, the brittle tension between his own skin and the world pressing in. Somewhere behind him, a vendor knocked over a glass jar and it shattered, sharp and clear, the fragments skittering like frightened bugs across the stone. The sound set off a flurry of whispers that rippled through the nearby crowd, some pitched high with surprise, others low and conspiratorial. He tried to force a laugh, to buy time, or at least the illusion of it.
That's impossible,
Kieran said.
I'd know, wouldn't I? I'd feel it somewhere.
Even as he said it, he realized how weak it sounded. In the market, impossibility was just another word for inventory. The merchant's head inclined just enough to acknowledge the irony.
Impossible things are all we sell here.
He tapped the still-closed book once with his gloved finger, a sound like a gavel coming down.
You may still reclaim your name if you can find the one who wears it. But beware, the world is not kind to those who walk in the same skin twice.
Kieran opened his mouth, then shut it again. He wanted to ask what would happen if he simply refused, if he left the market and tried to rebuild his life with whatever name was left to him. But the warning sat between them, unspoken but absolute. If he walked away now, the market would mark him. It always did. He thought of his life before, the years spent eroding himself against the city's cold shoulder, scraping together the illusion of a self from discarded hours and the half-remembered names of those who had once cared. He saw, in a quicksilver flash, the room he'd rented for 6 years, the chipped enamel on the sink, the stubborn window that opened onto a brick wall, the pile of books he'd never finished reading, the parade of jobs, each one more transient than the last, all of them leaving behind the same residue of failure and fatigue. Even his pleasures had been provisional, always borrowed on credit from a future he no longer believed would ever arrive. The market had promised, in its own twisted way, to make him whole, or at least to reveal what was missing. He remembered the long walks at midnight, the sense of being surveilled by something too vast to see, the little ticks and accidents of thought that did not seem to belong to him. He'd told himself that everyone felt this way, the gnawing doubt, the suspicion that he was not entirely present in his own life. But it was only in the market, with its impossible bargains and casual cruelties, that he had finally found language for it. The feeling that some essential piece of him had been lifted, not cleanly, but with a rough and lingering tear. Now it was confirmed. The merchant had said it plainly. Someone else is already living as you. The phrase echoed through him, settling into the pit of his stomach like a seed of ice. He tried to imagine this other Kieran, this double or imposter, and found the effort almost comforting. At least it provided a shape to his loss, a rationale for the failures and fissures that ran through his own story. He pictured a counterfeit Kieran, striding through the world with his name sewn snug across the shoulders, not caring if it chafed or hung crooked at the seams. Or maybe, a more disturbing thought, the other Kieran was the original, and he himself was the accident, the remainder, the footnote that trailed after a story already told. The market was a judge, but it could also be a jury. Kieran could feel the assembled presence of it, the vast and invisible crowd that adjudicated every transaction. The pressure was palpable. He glanced sideways and saw that the other stalls had quieted, their keepers watching him with the steadiness of predators evaluating a wounded thing. The air was charged with expectation, and he realized that the market would not simply let him slink away, not after coming this far, not after laying himself bare before the merchant's black mirror. He weighed his options, though the calculus was a bleak one. He could walk away, try to live nameless and unclaimed, but the market was notorious for collecting on its debts, even from those who thought themselves safely beyond its reach. Or he could pursue the other claimant, track down the impostor who wore his name and demand its return, knowing that the contest might cost him more than he could ever recover. The choice was his, but not freely given. It was the kind of choice that defined the limits of a person, that revealed whether one was made of sinew or smoke. The silence between Kieran and the merchant stretched until it became a living thing. The merchant sat perfectly still, hands folded and face veiled, patient as a spider. The only movement was the slight quivering of the slip of paper in front of Kieran. 2 names in black script, both of them alive and hungry. He wondered which was the true version, and which the forgery, or if in the market such distinctions even mattered. He reached for the paper, his fingers trembling with more than just fear. He could feel, as he touched it, the thrum of the market in his own pulse, a low electrical hum that seemed to promise violence or redemption, depending on what he chose next. The names on the slip seemed to blur and shift beneath his gaze, each letter a battle for territory. He wondered if this was how the merchant saw the world, not as a set of fixed identities, but as an endless war of erasures and substitutions. For a moment, he hesitated, not out of cowardice, but from the bone-deep understanding that the next step could not be reversed. He tried to remember the last time he'd been certain of anything, the last time he'd acted without the gnawing suspicion that every choice was already contaminated by forces beyond his knowing. The memory would not come. It was as if the market, in revealing his fracture, had also erased the possibility of ever having been whole. Kieran closed his eyes and pressed the slip of paper between his hands, as if by sheer force he could will the world to slow down, to grant him a moment of clarity. Instead, he felt a sudden weightlessness, as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He opened his eyes and found that the market had changed. The colors were sharper now, the shadows deeper, and the noise had risen to a fevered pitch. The shapes of people and booths warped at the edges, as if seen through a sheet of rippling glass. He realized, with a rush of terror, that his sense of self was dissolving, that he was, for the first time, truly unmoored from the archive of his own history. He staggered, clutching the counter for support. The merchant watched him, unblinking, as if measuring the rate of his collapse. Kieran wanted to curse him, to demand an explanation or a second chance, but the words caught in his throat. The only sound that escaped was a thin, involuntary whimper. Around him, the market seemed to lean in closer, hungry for whatever came next. He forced himself to breathe, to think. He could not give up, not when the possibility of reclaiming his name, his self, was still within reach. He fixed the merchant with a wild, pleading stare.
Where do I find him?
He asked.
Where do I find the one who stole my name?
The merchant's eyes flickered behind the gauze, and for the first time, Kieran thought he saw something like pity. The merchant spoke, voice gentler now, almost conspiratorial.
All doors are open to those who have nothing to lose.
He gestured, just once, toward an alley that slashed through the market like a scar.
Follow the black line. It will lead you to what you seek.
Kieran looked down and saw, running from the base of the merchant's booth to the far end of the market, a single streak of wet, black paint. It hadn't been there before, or else he'd never noticed it. The line pulsed with a strange luminescence, a slow throbbing that synchronized with his own heartbeat. He stepped away from the counter and felt the market's gaze press harder against his back. 1,000 silent witnesses invested in the outcome of his pursuit. He walked, one foot in front of the other, following the black line deeper into the warren of booths and banners. The air grew colder, the lights more erratic. The voices of the vendors twisted and merged, forming a kind of sonic fog that made it difficult to remember his own voice in the mix. He clutched the slip of paper in his fist, holding it like a talisman against the encroaching unreality. As he moved, the market seemed to rearrange itself around him. Passageways folded in on themselves, doors appeared and vanished, and the boundary between inside and outside became meaningless. He passed a stall selling shadows in glass jars, another offering the teeth of extinct animals, and a third where a child with no eyes tried to sell him back his fondest memory. He pressed on, resisting the urge to look back, knowing that any hesitation could mean losing the trail forever. At last, the black line ended at a doorway framed in hammered copper. On the door was a knocker shaped like an open hand, palm up, each finger engraved with a word in an alphabet Kieran did not recognize. He lifted the knocker and let it fall. The sound it made was not metallic, but organic, like the crack of a bone. The door swung open, and he stepped through. The room beyond was impossibly vast, lit by a single bulb that dangled from the ceiling by a wire so thin it seemed to slice the air. In the center of the room sat a man at a desk, his back to the door. The man was writing in a ledger, the scratch of the pen the only sound. Kieran knew, without knowing how, that this was the other claimant, the one who wore his name. He approached, each step feeling like a trespass. The man did not look up, did not acknowledge Kieran's presence, but continued to write. Kieran circled around the desk, heart pounding, and saw that the man's face was his own. Not similar, not a rough approximation, but a perfect replica down to the scar on the left eyebrow, the shadow of stubble on the jaw. Only the eyes were different, cold, luminous, and utterly unfamiliar. He'd seen him once before in a dream, back when the market was only rumor, A cautionary tale traded over cheap beer and the digital embers of a forum now lost to time. In the dream, he'd chased himself down an endless corridor lined with mirrors, each pane reflecting a version of him he was certain he'd never been and could never be. A prodigy, a priest, a murderer, a man who'd managed to love without fear. He'd woken then, gasping, unable to recall which version he'd been trying to catch. Now the corridor was real, and every step toward the ledger doubled the weight of his heart. The other Kieran finished his entry with brutal finality, closed the book, and leveled his gaze. There was no question of kinship, no flicker of surprise or curiosity. The silence in the room was so thick it might as well have been water. For a moment, neither moved. It was not a duel, but something more sacred and more profane. The moment when the condemned meets the executioner and finds the noose braided from his own hair. Kieran stared at the duplicate, hunting for evidence of fraud, a slip in symmetry, a detail out of place. But the illusion was perfect. He could even smell his own scent on the man, an amalgam of nervous sweat, cold air, and the sweet rot of old cigarettes. It was like seeing his own ghost, except the ghost was better at living. He tried to speak, but the duplicate beat him to it, folding his hands with the same unconscious precision Kieran sometimes glimpsed in himself during moments of anxious waiting.
I was wondering when you'd show up,
said the man, voice both familiar and other. The words came out with the confidence of someone who'd already won. Kieran's mouth was dry.
You're...
The real one?
The man's smile was surgical.
If that makes it easier, sure. But you know that's not how it works.
He tried again.
You. You took my name.
A gentle laugh, almost affectionate.
No, you gave it away. Not everyone remembers their part in the bargain, but everyone makes one.
The man stood, motioned to a pair of chairs that faced each other like rivals in an interrogation chamber.
Sit, if you'd like. Or don't. It doesn't change what happens next.
Kieran sat, less from choice than the undertow of inevitability. The room was colder now, the single bulb above them flickering with uncertain zeal. He watched the other's hands, the deep groove on the index finger, the chewed cuticle, the faint arc of ink beneath the nail that must have come from another ledger, another confession. They were his hands, but they were doing things he would never dare. The duplicate regarded him with something close to pity.
The market below is orderly, despite what people think. Every exchange is tracked, every debt called eventually. The merchant doesn't care who remembers, only that the ledger balances in the end.
Kieran's voice trembled.
If that's true, why do I still exist?
A pause, then a soft shrug.
Entropy. Leaks happen. Sometimes the residue of a name clings to what's left behind. A shadow, a recursion. Most fade. You didn't.
He smiled again, but less cruelly this time.
I was almost proud.
The words stung.
You talk like you know me.
I am you.
The man said simply.
Or I was, before you made the trade. You offered up everything that made you you, and now you're surprised to find yourself empty-handed.
That's not...
He flinched from finishing the thought. He had been empty before the market, hadn't he? Wasn't that why he'd gone down there in the first place?
I just wanted...
To be someone.
The man finished.
To matter. That's what everyone wants. It's why the market exists, why the merchant can always charge more than you'd ever imagine.
He leaned across the desk, eyes glittering.
What are you willing to pay for another chance at meaning, Kieran?
His name, spoken aloud, was a punch to the gut. He realized with horror that the voice in his head, the private, unmarked monologue of Kieran Vale, sounded less and less like his own. The double's cadence was replacing his, syllable by syllable, until he could barely remember which of them had said what. He reached into his pocket for the slip of paper, but it was gone. Of course it was gone. He'd left the last of his identity in the merchant's scales, and what remained was only this: a spectacle, a reckoning, a lesson for the next fool who thought he could outwit the market. He watched as the double stood, moving around the desk with a fluidity that made Kieran ache with envy. He wore the same off-the-rack suit, but it fit him better. His stride was confident, his posture unassailable. He didn't just inhabit the world, he bent it gently to his will.
This isn't fair.
Kieran muttered, and hated himself for how childish it sounded. The man stopped, half in shadow, his mouth twisted in what might have been sympathy.
Fairness is for those who can afford to lose. The market is for the desperate, for the ones who will do anything for a glimmer of substance, like you did, like I did.
The memory surfaced. The night he'd gone below. The cold stone steps. The endless maze of arcades and alleys. The promise that if he outwitted the merchant, he could have whatever he desired. But he'd never wanted anything enough to know what it was. He'd sold his name not to gain something, but to escape the burden of not having anything worth keeping. Now the absence gnawed at him, a hunger that reason couldn't touch. He looked at his double, searching for some hint of guilt, some sign that the old self survived inside the new. But the man was serene, almost sad.
If you want your name back,
He said,
challenge me for it. Take it if you can.
But I don't even know what it means anymore.
That's the price.
the man said.
If you win, you become me. If you lose, you vanish for good.
A game, then. A duel of selves, the kind he'd always lost. He found himself standing, fists balled at his sides, fury and terror commingling in a chemical rush.
You think I'm afraid to fight you?
I know you are,
Said the double.
but sometimes fear is all that's left.
He moved forward, and Kieran realized they were the same height, the same lean build, the same nervous tick in the jaw. The symmetry was nauseating. He thought of the market, of all the bargains struck in its endless warrens, the ones that ended in blood, the ones that ended in nothing. He wondered how many Kierans had come through here, and how many were left behind, shadows on the wall. The man reached into his coat and drew out the black coin, the one Kieran had seen in the merchant's hand.
This is the real balance.
He said, tossing the coin from palm to palm.
One side for memory, one for oblivion. Flip it and let the market decide who walks out.
Kieran stared at the coin, dizzy with recognition. He remembered the feel of it, cold and heavy, as the merchant had pressed it into his palm. He remembered the way it had burned, the way it had left a mark that would not wash away. He remembered, but the memories were fading, slippery as oil on glass.
Why?
He asked. It was the only question that mattered. The man stopped tossing the coin.
Because the market is hungry and so are we. Because names are just the first thing we sell. There's always more to give away.
He held out the coin between thumb and forefinger.
Call it. Heads, you take it all back. Tails, you disappear and I'm free for good.
The rules were simple. The rules were everything. He reached for the coin, but the other closed his hand around it, smiling faintly.
First, you have to remember why you came. Otherwise, there's nothing to come back to.
He closed his eyes, tried to find the memory. The real one, not the stories he told himself. He saw the apartment, the stacks of unopened mail, the messages from friends he'd stopped answering. He remembered the first time he realized he was invisible, not just in the world, but in his own skin. He remembered the hollow ache of longing for a self that never quite arrived. He remembered the market and the promise that he could be more. He opened his eyes.
I wanted to matter,
He said.
even if it hurt.
The man nodded.
Then call it.
He flipped the coin. It spun, a blur of darkness and light, and for a moment he saw both lives unfolding at once. One Kieran, living in the world with a name and a history, making mistakes and sometimes even being forgiven. The other, drifting like vapor, touching nothing and being touched by nothing. A rumor of a man who once was. The coin landed and rolled, slow at first, then faster, then slower again until it wobbled on its edge. He reached out, heart pounding.